Welcome in tonight's program. My guest tonight is Karim Armstrong, one of the most famous scholar of her time. Karim, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
She's known as one of the best scholars of her time. She's into religious, writing about religion, Islam, Judaism, Christianity. I would like to tell you the bestsellers that she's written is A History of Jerusalem, The Battle for God, Buddha, and she has also been a nun for 7 years. And she wrote about her experiences as a nun through the narrow gate. It was one of the bestsellers. We will be talking about fundamentalism. We'll be talking about militant piety, why she has written or she believes that although Western world has undergone a complete revolution of thought in recent century, but its mistrust of Islam is essentially medieval. Why? So Karim, as I said, welcome to the show and a great honor to be with you. How come you're so attracted towards Islam and your research is based on this religion a lot and people really admire you? Even Muslims admire you more than anybody else.
Well, I have become more known for my work on Islam since 9/11, but I've written about all the world religions and like to keep that universal focus. Islam appeals to me and always did appeal to me chiefly because of its pluralism. The Quran is a very pluralistic document. It has a great appreciation of other religious scriptures. It sees all rightly guided religion as coming from God. And the Sufis in it too have a wonderful tradition, set a wonderful precedent for appreciation of other people's faith. And that I find most inspiring.
So in other words, you're saying you find it a very tolerant religion, an understanding religion towards, has the depth of understanding for others.
Potentially, it is.
It is. But how come today it is associated with suicide bombings? Why?
Well, this is largely because of politics. We really oughtn't to call this Islamic terrorism. This is political terrorism that's often expressed in an Islamic framework. But its inspiration comes from politics. You could call it a religiously expressed form of nationalism or identity politics. There's an imbalance of power in the world, and outstanding political issues have been left unresolved. They've festered, they've become symbolic. Kashmir, Israel, Palestine, and people have begun to feel hopeless of the political situation and have resorted to violent means. It's also true that much of the terrorism that we are seeing that has become so violent has taken root in areas where warfare and violence and conflict have become endemic. In the Middle East, Gaza, in Afghanistan. And that means that religion has got sucked into the general violence and become a part of the problem.
So how do the Europeans see today, or the Americans see, or the Westerners see Islam?
Well, Western people have always had a difficult relationship with Islam. They see they've seen it since the Middle Ages, really, as a faith that is violent and intolerant, they used to see it as sexually permissive because the Prophet had so many wives. And when the West was coming to birth, Islam was the great world power. It was like the United States today, and Europe was like a third world region. And it expressed a great kind of resentment and jealousy of this faith, which seemed a sort of younger, more vibrant, powerful version of their own faith. And now, of course, since 9/11, unfortunately, the actions of the terrorists seem to have confirmed their suspicions that Islam is a religion of the sword, which, of course, it is not. And Americans and Europeans differ in this matter. The West is not a monolithic entity any more than Islam is.
So when you say they differ, Europe and Americans, what is the difference?
Well, Europeans are much more secular. Europeans religion is losing ground in Europe. In my country, only 6% of the population attend a religious service regularly. And I wouldn't mind laying a bet that most of those 6% are Muslims in our country, who've bumped up our national worship average. Now, so therefore many Western people see Islam as the worst kind of religion. Terrorism and, you know, oppression of women, that kind of thing. But Europeans do have a better understanding of the political situation than Americans. They understand about Palestine much more than the Americans do. Palestine gets a much better representation in the European press than it does in the United States.
But is fundamentalism today only associated with Islam? Although
No.
We see in other religions also killing of Yasser Rabin in Israel and Oklahoma bombing and these.
Well, it's important, first of all, to distinguish what we call fundamentalism from terrorism.
Let's define what fundamentalism.
Fundamentalism is not violent, and it's certainly not Islamic. It's not confined to the Muslim world at all. It's a militant form of piety that grew up in most of the world faiths as a response to modern secularization. In every region where a modern secular style government has established itself that separates religion and politics on the Western model, a religious countercultural protest has grown up alongside it in deliberate reaction. And so you have fundamentalist Buddhists, fundamentalist Sikhs, fundamentalist Jews, Christians, fundamentalist Muslims, and even fundamentalist Confucians in China. And their object is to bring back God and religion from the sidelines, to which the wings, as it were, to which they've been pushed in a modern secular culture, and put them back on centre stage. Now, most of these fundamentalists are simply trying to live a good life, a religious life, in a world that they feel as hostile to religion. Every fundamentalist movement that I've studied in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is rooted in fear. A fear of annihilation. They are afraid that the modern, secular, liberal establishment wants to wipe out religion. And this isn't always paranoid.
So it is actually this idea of annihilation actually forced religion to bounce back, because in the early 20th century, people thought probably religion, with the advancement of modern technology
Yes.
and things, may not play a wide or pivotal role in future. But we are seeing it's the religion which has bounced back and playing the key role.
Yes, you can't suppress religion, and when you try to do so, then it'll come back, and not always in a very healthy form. You're right, in the middle of the 20th century, we saw secularism as the coming ideology. But since the 70s, there's been a massive religious revival, and people all over the world, except in Western Europe, have shown that they want to see religion reflected more clearly in public life. But only a tiny, tiny proportion of these people take part in acts of terror and violence. So one shouldn't associate fundamentalism with terrorism per se.
So what is your experience? How would you like to analyze fundamentalism in the Islamic world today?
Well, it takes many forms.
Okay.
Islam was the last of the three religions of Abraham, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, to develop a fundamentalist strain in the 1960s, because as fundamentalism is a rebellion against secular modernity, secular modernity has to take root in a region before there can be a reaction against it. And in the late 60s, many people in the Middle East felt that the secular ideologies that had been imported during the colonial period had failed them. Nationalism, socialism, they had no grassroots among the people. People wanted to go back to their roots. And the whole idea of a nation state, for example, which is not natural to Islam. It's a modern Western European invention, and it hasn't been a very good invention. Nationalism caused 2 major world wars in Europe. So people have been disturbed by the new secularism. They don't understand the secularist institutions, and so they've started to restate Islam, often in a more traditional form than usual. And very often, if you look at these various fundamentalist movements that take different forms in different parts of the Muslim world, they usually reflect what's going on in the secular government of that time.
So what is militant piety?
Well, the fundamentalists feel embattled. They feel they're under attack. And this isn't just paranoid. When Ataturk in Turkey modernized Turkey, he closed down all the madrasas and he abolished the Sufi orders and pushed them underground. And this seemed an attack upon religion. In Iran, the Shahs used to make their soldiers go out with their bayonets, taking off the women's veils and ripping them to pieces in front of them. And on one occasion, Shah Reza Pahlavi gave his soldiers orders to shoot at hundreds of demonstrators in Mashhad, one of the holiest shrines of Iran, because they were peacefully protesting against compulsory Western dress. And hundreds of Iranians were killed this day. Now, in this context, secularism doesn't seem benign. It seems lethal. And some of the most extreme forms of Sunni fundamentalism developed in Egypt, in the concentration camps into which President Nasser imprisoned many of the Muslim Brotherhood, often without trial, and often they'd done nothing worse than handing out a few leaflets or attending a meeting of the Muslim Brothers. And there they were subjected to physical and mental torture. And one of those prisoners was Sayyid Qutb, who went into the camp as a moderate reformer. And when he looked around, however, at this horrible prison where he saw his brothers being tortured, executed, he himself was tortured, he was hung upside down by his feet, he had terrible diseases in prison. And when at the same time he heard Nasser vowing to secularize Egypt on the Western model and privatize Islam and make Egypt a secular state, secularism didn't seem good to him.
So it is the wrong interpretation of secularism, and by force implying secularism, which has actually created differences between the interpretation of secularism in the West and Islam.
When it's not necessarily a false perception of secularism, because secularism has been violent. In the Jewish tradition, for example, fundamentalism took 2 major steps forward. One was after the Nazi Holocaust, when Hitler had tried to exterminate all the European Jews. And secularism has been imposed so rapidly in the Muslim world that it's often been violent and aggressive, as we've seen with the Shahs, with Nasser. And it's felt as an assault. So it's not a misperception of secularism, it's just that secularism has attacked Muslims, and it also Christians in the United States also feel attacked by the secular ethos of Harvard or Yale or Washington, and their fundamentalism has grown out of a sense of humiliation, of seeing their sacred beliefs trampled upon and sneered at by the establishment, relegated to old-fashioned nonsense, and they fought back.
So in other words, modern technology, modern rational explanations of these universities, of intellectuals, has actually forced them.
No, it's not rationalism that's done this. This is the separation of secularism. It's nothing to do with rationalism. It's the separation of religion and politics.
Okay.
taking the separation of government and politics, pushing religion to the sidelines of public life. And that with it has, I'm afraid, often come a certain contempt for religion, as we have in my country. There's great contempt for religion in Britain.
Islam is the fastest growing religion in the United States also, and also in Europe. Why people are attracted towards Islam?
Well, I think in the United States, many of the African American community have been attracted to Islam because of its, first of all, because it's outside the Christian tradition, which enslaved them in the first place, which the Christians endorsed slavery for many years, and certain bad forms of Christianity established a form of apartheid in some of the American states. Now, Islam is talking about freedom and equality and social concern and justice, and that is very appealing to black people. It's in other parts of the world, well, Islam is an attractive religion. I'm not surprised that it's gaining adherents, though it's probably not gaining many adherents in Europe. No religions are gaining adherents in Europe.
We'll continue talking to Karim Armstrong. We'll take a short break and we'll be back after a short break. Stay tuned to Indus. Welcome back, and I'm talking to Karim Armstrong, one of the famous scholars of her time, and we are very honored to have her with us tonight. Karim, women are empowered in Islam, and if I'm not wrong, 1400 years ago, women had the share in property, and she was authorized to look after her property. It's not the male who was supposed to look after her property by empowering her with power and property and money and rights. She had a place in society. How come today male or men around the world thinks that Islam doesn't empower her?
Well, it has to be said, first of all, that no world religion has been good for women. And some of them started out well for women. Christianity did. Jesus had women disciples, and in the Gospels, women get a very good press. And the early Christians felt that there was no distinction between men and women. And the emancipation of women was something that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, felt very strongly about. He really appreciated women and wanted to give them rights. And as you've mentioned, the Quran gives women rights of inheritance and divorce that Western women wouldn't have until the 19th century. But it wasn't long before, only a few generations after the Prophet, that the men, as it were, hijacked the religion and dragged it back to the old patriarchy. And exactly the same thing happened in Christianity.
It's the customs, it's the tradition, tribal customs actually hijacked religion?
The old male ethos. And you must remember that many of the Prophet's companions, even Umar, for example, did not understand his attitude to women. Patriarchy, the male dominance, was so deeply entrenched in the Arabian psyche that they couldn't go along with their prophet. And in my latest biography of Muhammad, I've tried to show how this worked out in Medina at that time, the conflict that there was about the position of women at a very difficult time when the Muslim community was being attacked by Mecca. So, and the same happened in the Christian world. Despite this excellent start, again, male dominance was so entrenched that people just discounted the
Is it because most of the religious books are translated by men and not by women? They don't understand.
Well, women, until very recently, women have not really been educated. Women's education has made a massive impact throughout all the world religions. Women are asserting the rights and pointing to the founders and pointing out that these men who think that they are second-class citizens are at fault here. This is happening in Islam. There you have some fine Muslim feminists, and the Christian world, where Christians and Jewish women are training to be rabbis and priests, and against great opposition. So it's been a flaw of the religions to discount the voice of half the human race. And it certainly wasn't what the Prophet Muhammad wanted.
Do you think people are still interested in religion today around the world? Or do you think it's only the fundamentalists who keep on preaching and saying that this is the religion which should take important place in the society?
No, I don't. I've been in Pakistan now for 4 or 5 days, and my lectures have been packed. We've had to turn people away. And we didn't think that in this particular political juncture of your country, that people would have the energy to come to lectures on religion. But I think people are hungry to hear about religion. Not in my country. In London, nobody wants to hear about religion. But in the United States, there's and in the Muslim countries that I've visited, certainly, there's a real longing for something deeper in life than simply the materialism. Saying there must be more to religion than these fundamentalists are saying. People who feel that the fundamentalists are taking their religion away from them, and who want to see a more pluralistic, wide, universal view.
How to handle this situation if the fundamentalists are taking away religion? I mean, how to deal with this situation? Well,
it's no good attacking them.
Okay.
Because history has shown that when you attack these movements, they become more extreme. And so it's counterproductive. It's counterproductive for countries like France to tell women not to wear the veil, for example. History shows that when women have been forbidden to wear the veil, they have rushed in ever greater numbers to put it on.
To defy.
To say, don't tell us what to do. And quite right. I don't think a woman should be told what to wear, either forced into a hijab or told she must not wear it. I wore a veil myself for many years as a nun, and in some senses found it quite an empowering experience. For all those years of my young girlhood, I never once had to think about my hair or my makeup or my clothes.
Because your face was all covered.
Well, not my face wasn't.
No, I mean your hair.
You put the same thing on every day.
Yeah.
I didn't have to fill my mind with the trash and rubbish and triviality that our cultures all encourage women. And that helps us to keep us back from serious achievement too, I think. We concern ourselves too much with frippery of that sort.
So what does your research say? That it is compulsory in all religions to cover head?
No, it isn't, not at all.
What about Islam?
Islam does not, the Quran does not say that all women should be veiled. In the Quran, it's simply the Prophet's wives that should wear some distinguishing mark. Veiling came in about 2 or 3 generations after the death of the Prophet, largely because the people in these regions, the Greeks, the Persians, they'd veiled their women for a long time. And for many centuries, veiling was a prerogative of the upper classes. It was a sign of an upper-class woman to wear a veil. I'm not talking about a head covering in the sun, in the fields. These are worn by men and women. But veiling became a hot issue in the Muslim world, largely as a result, I'm afraid, of the British. In Egypt, for example, Lord Cromer, the Consul General in the late 19th century, said that veiling was a disgusting habit, and that until Muslims gave up the practice of veiling their women, the Muslims, the Egyptians, would need the West to help them into the modern world. Now, Lord Cromer didn't give a fig for the emancipation of women. He was a founder member in London of a society that was designed to prevent women getting the vote. But he used this feminist imagery to promote the colonial project. And predictably, Muslims in Egypt said, don't tell us what to wear, don't tell us about our culture. And the veil became a symbol of authentic Islam as opposed to Western influence. And it's often remained so. More women today in the United States are putting on the veil to dissociate themselves from the Bush administration and its policies.
So what about colonialism? Has colonialism actually left a great impact on the people to take certain lines which we today call fundamentalist?
I think a lot of the problems in, say, the Muslim or indeed the African world for that matter, spring from the colonial period. It was a massive disruption. A lot of people want to go back to their roots before the British and the French came in and transformed their society. And colonialism goes on. It doesn't just disappear when the colonialists go home, go back to Europe. It continues in people's minds, and indeed control is still coming out of Washington in one way or another. There's still dominance here. Now, this has made it very difficult for the colonized countries to come to modernity. One of the hallmarks of modernity is freedom and independence. In Europe, the modern society was established by declarations of independence. Religious, when Luther declared independence of the Catholic Church. Political, social, economic. Inventors and scientists say you must give us freedom to think so that we can become productive and advance knowledge. Now, the new modern economy came, however, to countries in the Middle East or India, not with independence, but with colonial dependence. And that has skewed things a great deal. So I think, yes, colonialism, it's noticeable that countries that weren't colonized, such as Turkey or Japan, which was never subject to colonial or even foreign influence of any sort, they may have had a rough ride modernizing their societies. Everybody does. Europe did too. But they've been able to make a much more easy transition to the modern world. And Japan in particular had its own particular brand of the modern economy, which has been remarkably successful. And they weren't colonized. They didn't have that disruption in their history. And that sense of being a second-class citizen. And Islam had the humiliation of being a major world power, reduced overnight to a dependency, a subjugated race.
Okay, we'll continue on this. We'll take a short break and we'll be back after a break. Welcome back. And I'm talking to Karim Armstrong, famous scholar of our times. Karim, you were a nun for 7 years and then you, of course, left it. What happened? How this transformation in you came, if you would like to talk about it?
Well, I left my order because I wasn't supposed to be a nun. Very few people can live that life successfully. And I entered the religious life far too young. I was only 17. Too young to make up my mind about such massive issues as lifelong celibacy, for example. But I don't regret my time in the convent. I wouldn't be here with you today if I hadn't been there, because my life has been, in some sense, a continual quest, as it were, to find out what is God, what is sacred. And I didn't find God in the convent. For many years I went right away from religion, and I wanted nothing whatever to do with it. And it's been my study of the other traditions, including Islam, that has given me a wider perspective on what religion is about.
Did you find anything common in three religions that you just talked about?
Judaism, Christianity and Islam, like all the major world religions, have at their heart a concern with compassion. You begin any reading with the Quran with the Bismillah, in the name of Allah, the compassionate, the merciful. The constant message of the Quran is to look after the poor and needy members of society. That's what the Quran is teaching, rather than a doctrine. It's the same with the other religions. Buddhism too, Confucianism. The golden rule is central to all the major world religions. Can I just finish? Do not treat other people as you would not like to be treated yourself. Now, if we observe that day by day, hour by hour, as Confucius recommended, we'd have a better world.
Has the word compassion been defined in a different manner in the modern context?
The modern world isn't very compassionate. It may say it is, but it's not. It's quite ruthless.
They talk a lot about it.
They talk about it, but they don't put their actions where their mouth is, because modernity, the modern world, has often enslaved and subjugated people from day one. Colonized people were one, slaves of Africa were another, Native Americans another. Today you have the Palestinians, also victims of modernization. So it's not really compassionate, though we do care about making sure the poor get enough to eat and that kind of thing, as long as we're not inconvenienced ourselves. But compassion is often interpreted as being sorry for people. It doesn't mean that. It means to feel with them. It comes from a Greek and Latin root saying to feel with the other, kompathein. So you put yourself in the position of another human being. Leave your own self-interest behind. Take yourself down from the center of your world and put another there. And all the religions say that that is the way you come to know what we call God.
Today in the Islamic world there is a lot of confusion, and there's a lot of different interpretations, many interpretations of fundamentalism and fundamentalist. Do you think once there is sensibility in the political order around the world, for example, they don't like Bush anymore, President Bush, because they think it is the American policies which have actually degraded Muslims in Afghanistan, in Iraq and other. Do you think if there's a change of political philosophy or change of governments in other countries, will this war of fundamentalists or will the war of Islamic fundamentalists be subsided?
I was part of a United Nations initiative called the Alliance of Civilizations, which was asked to look into the causes of extremism. And in our report, we said that the problem was politics. It's not religion. People don't read the Quran and then rush off and bomb a London bus. They decide to bomb a London bus for all kinds of political reasons, and they may find a couple of verses in the Quran which seems, though it of course does not, to endorse that kind of behavior. Now, there's too much power invested in too few people. There are ongoing disputes that have been unresolved. Palestine, Kashmir, the problem in Afghanistan, a country that was simply left to fester after it had been a theatre of the Cold War for many years. Pakistan, of course, was on the front line there. And this has soured people, that people feel hopeless and angry because whatever they seem to do, they know that because of the powers that be, first in Britain, then in the United States, nothing will change. And that's when they take to desperate actions. People in Gaza, for example, who feel abandoned by the world, have turned very late in their sad history to terror. And now the only way in which we can combat this extremism is to right these injustices, make them right, put them right. And that involves a major change of heart, I'm afraid, in the United States. I'm not surprised that people are appalled by President Bush. Most of us are in Britain, and Tony Blair completely lost his popularity in Britain because of his support for Bush in this misnamed war on terror. But it will need, whether we'll have a different kind of presidency in the upcoming presidential elections that will have the courage to reverse American policy on many of these contentious issues, doesn't look very hopeful, I'm afraid.
Do you think people around the world can come closer on the basis of religion?
They should do. If they don't use their religion to sneer at other people or say, you're wrong, we're right. Ego comes into this. This is not religion. Ego comes into this. It is the task of every religious person, as it is the task of every secular person, to work for global understanding, global harmony. Any ideology, whether it's religious or secular, that does not promote global harmony, but instead preaches a disdain, contempt, hatred, whether they're Muslim, Christian, Jewish, American, secular, British, they fail the test of our time. And I think religious people all over the world have to make an effort, what you call a jihad, a struggle, an effort, to make that pluralistic compassion an active force in the world to counter the terrorism, violence and disdain that we're seeing in our politics today.
Thank you very much, Karim. With this, we come to an end of this program. Thank you for joining us tonight. Good night.
आज के प्रोग्राम में आपको वेलकम